I'm going to be reading Module 4, Lesson 1, which is entitled Geography in Early Egypt. And this starts on 104 in your textbook. So, in front of you on the screen, you'll see that I have the PDF version of the textbook in Kami, so you can read along that way. Or if you have your textbook in front of you, like I do, you can read from it. So it starts on page 104. So geography in early Egypt. If you were there, your family farms in the Nile Valley. Each year, when the river's floodwaters spread rich soil on the land, you help your father plant barley. When you are not in the fields, you spin fine linen thread from flax you have grown. Sometimes you and your friends hunt birds in the tall grasses along the river banks. Why do you like living in the Nile Valley? So on the right um, side of your textbook on page 105, you will see the Nile Valley. Okay, so we're going to think about why this area was so prosperous and why people who live there were able to grow crops and be able to create the first civilizations on the planet. So back to our textbook, The Gift of the Nile in red. Geography played a key role in the development of Egyptian civilization. The Nile River brought life to Egypt and allowed it to thrive. The river was so important to people in this region that a Greek historian named Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. Over time, Egyptians developed technologies that helped them take advantage of the river. Now we're going to look at location physical features. The Nile is the longest river in the world, which is debatable. Okay, it's either the first or the second largest. It's definitely the longest river in Africa. Okay, it begins in Central Africa and runs north through Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea, a distance of over 4,000 miles. So it's definitely either the first or second longest. The civilization of ancient Egypt developed along a 750-mile stretch of the Nile. Ancient Egypt included two regions, a southern region and a northern region. The southern region was called Upper Egypt. It was so named because it was located upriver in relation to the Nile's flow. Lower Egypt, the northern region, was located downriver. The Nile sliced through the desert of Upper Egypt. There, it created a fertile river valley about 13 miles wide. On either side lay hundreds of miles of desert. The Nile flowed through rocky, hilly lands south of Egypt. At several points, this rough terrain caused cataracts, or rapids, to form. The first cataract, located 720 miles south of the Mediterranean Sea, marked the southern border of Upper Egypt. 5 more cataracts lay farther south. These cataracts made sailing on that portion of the Nile very difficult. In Lower Egypt, the Nile divided into several branches that fanned out and flowed into the Mediterranean Sea. These branches formed a delta, a triangle-shaped area of land made from soil deposited by a river. In ancient times, swamps and marshes covered much of the Nile Delta. Some two-thirds of Egypt's fertile farmland was located in the Nile Delta. So for your questions, you're going to have some vocabulary questions. I'm going to take a break for a second. The first one was cataracts on page 104, and those are rapids. So you're thinking of the water in the river rapids, very, very violent moving river. And because of the terrain or the land being very rough and hilly, it created these rapids. And then a delta, if you look up here on the map, right at the Mediterranean Sea, you'll see the Nile Delta. So that's where the river, if you look from down here south as it's flowing, it's just one river, and then as it gets closer to the Mediterranean Sea, it fans out into the sea, and that's called a delta. And if you kind of look, it is like a triangular shape. So those are first two vocabulary words. We're back to page 105 to the floods of the Nile down here. Because little rain fell in the region, most of Egypt was desert. Each year, however, rainfall far to the south of Egypt in the highlands of East Africa caused the Nile to flood. The Nile's floods were easier to predict than those of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. Almost every year, the Nile flooded Upper Egypt in midsummer and Lower Egypt in the fall. The Nile's flooding coated the land around it with rich silt. As in Mesopotamia, the silt made the soil ideal for farming. The silt also made the land a dark color. This is why Egyptians called their country the Black Land. They called their dry, lifeless desert beyond the river valley the Red Land. Each year, Egyptians eagerly awaited the flooding of the Nile. For them, the river's floods were a life-giving miracle. This is why the Nile is featured in many Egyptian myths and rituals. Without the floods, people never could have farmed in Egypt. So if you were in class when we had class last, before we went remote, I talked about Mesopotamia, and we talked about how flooding actually benefited the people living in Mesopotamia because it made the land around the rivers that flooded so rich, and it made it very, very fertile. Okay, which means it was very easy to grow things in that land. So Egypt was the same way around the Nile River. The river, when it flooded, it made the land around the river very fertile and rich, and it was easy to grow things. Civilizations develops in Egypt. The Nile provided both water and fertile soil for farming. Over time, scattered farms grew into villages and then cities. Eventually, an Egyptian civilization developed. Increased food production. So since the land was so fertile, easy to grow things in, the food production went up. So hunter-gatherers first moved into the Nile Valley more than 12,000 years ago. They found plants, wild animals, and fish there to eat. In time, these people learned how to farm, and they settled along the Nile. By 4500 BC, farmers living in small villages grew wheat and barley. Over time, however, Egyptians needed to modify their environment in order to feed growing populations. As in Mesopotamia, farmers in Egypt developed an irrigation system to improve agricultural production. Unlike farmers in Mesopotamia, however, Egyptian farmers did not need to build basins for storing water. The Egyptians simply built a series of canals and walls to direct the river's flow and carry water to their fields. The Nile provided Egyptian farmers with an abundance of food, which means a lot of food. In addition to watering their crops, the Nile allowed farmers to raise animals. Farmers in Egypt grew wheat, barley, fruits, and vegetables. They raised cattle and sheep. The river provided many types of fish, and hunters trapped wild geese and ducks along its banks. Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians enjoyed a varied diet. Even today, The Nile continues to be a valuable resource for people living along its banks. Recent technologies have changed how Egyptians interact with the Nile. For example, construction of the Aswan High Dam along the Nile River was completed in 1970. The dam provides a significant source of electric power. This electricity has improved the standard of living for many people in the region. So that's a neat example of alternative energy or renewable energy. So the river creates electricity, like hydroelectricity, if I'm remembering the term right, from the water that flows through the dam. So that's pretty cool. Construction of the dam also has negative consequences. Farmers in Egypt still rely on the fertile lands along the river to grow food. However, the dam limits the amount of silt on the farmland from annual flooding. The silt from the river makes farmland more productive. Egyptians now use fertilizer on farmland to make up for the lost silt. So there's a positive thing with the dams, that it makes electricity. However, the flooding that makes the land is not as fertile and rich as it used to be because of this dam, because the dam is preventing the flooding. Two kingdoms, back on page 106. In addition to a stable food supply, Egypt's location offered another advantage. It had natural barriers that made it hard to invade Egypt. The desert to the west was too big and harsh to cross. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea kept many enemies away. More desert lands and the Red Sea to the east provided protection against invasion as well. In addition, cataracts in the Nile made it difficult for invaders to sail in from the south. Protected from invaders, the villages of Egypt grew. Wealthy farmers emerged as village leaders, and strong leaders gained control over several villages. By 3200 BC, the villages had grown, banded together, and developed into two kingdoms. One kingdom was called Lower Egypt, and the other was called Upper Egypt. Each kingdom had its own capital city, where its ruler or a leader was based. The capital of Egypt, or Lower Egypt, was located in the northwest Nile Delta at the time of Pi or Pe. There, wearing the red crown that symbolized his authority, the king of Lower Egypt ruled. The capital city of Upper Egypt was called Nekhen, or Niken. It was located on the west bank of the Nile. In this southern kingdom, the king wore a cone-shaped white crown. For centuries, Egyptians referred to their country as the Two Lands. Down at the bottom of this page, you'll be able to see what they're talking about with the things that they wore on their heads. So on page 108, kings unify Egypt. According to tradition, around 3100 BC, Menes rose to power in Upper Egypt. Some historians think Menes is a myth, and that his accomplishments were really those of another king called Aha, Scorpion, or Narmer. Menes wanted to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. His armies invaded and took control of Lower Egypt. He then married a princess from Lower Egypt to strengthen his control over the newly unified country. He wore both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt to symbolize his leadership over the two kingdoms. Later, he combined the two crowns into a double crown. He formed one government in Egypt under a single monarchy. Government power was more centralized in Egypt than in other places such as Sumer. In Sumer, leaders ruled over individual city-states. These city-states controlled large areas within Sumer. The government in Egypt, however, ruled over all the cities within Egypt's borders. Many historians consider Menes to be Egypt's first pharaoh, the title used by rulers of Egypt. The title pharaoh means great house. Pharaoh ruled over Egypt with total control. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh acted as a mediator between the people and the gods. So Egyptians believed that whoever the pharaoh was, that person was the one who communicated to the gods, okay, for the rest of Egypt. The idea provided further reason to justify the pharaoh's rule. Menes founded Egypt's first dynasty, or series of rulers from the same family. Under dynasties, rule was generally passed from one generation to the next, which gave them significant political power. Pharaohs used this power to make laws and enforce order. Menes built a new capital city at the southern tip of the Nile Delta. The city was later named Memphis. For centuries, Memphis was the political and cultural center of Egypt. Many government offices were located there, and the city bustled with artistic activity. Last page. The first dynasty lasted for about 200 years. Rulers who came after Menes also wore the double crown to symbolize their rule over Upper and Lower Egypt. They extended Egyptian territory southward along the Nile and into the southwest Asia. Eventually, however, rivals arose to challenge the first dynasty for power. These challengers took over Egypt and established the second dynasty. And then, as we read, ancient Egypt began in the fertile Nile River Valley. Two kingdoms developed. The two kingdoms were later united under one ruler, and the territory grew. In the next lesson, we are going to learn about how Egypt continued to grow and change under later rulers in a period known as the Old Kingdom. So that is the conclusion of Lesson 1. Next week, we are going to look at the Old Kingdom, which starts on page 110. And real quick, I will show you what you're going to do for your questions. So your questions are right here. And there are 10 of them. So you have some fill in the blanks, you have some true and false, you have multiple choice, and then you have 5 vocabulary questions. So you have where you're going to go in and you're going to collect the correct term. Thank you for watching, and next week we will, like I said, look at Lesson 2.